Montana Territory, August 1878. They found the girl crouched beside a burned-out wagon, her dress torn, hands covered in soot, and not a tear left in her eyes. The wind whipped dust around the small cluster of men on horseback, but it was the girl who made them all fall quiet. "She's the one they call bad luck," someone muttered. Quentin Pierce reined in his buckskin gelding and stared down at her. "What's your name?" The girl looked up, squinting against the sun. She could not have been much older than 20, but her eyes were too tired for that age. "Brielle," she said. "Brielle Callahan." No one else had survived the ambush. Just her. A man behind Quentin spat into the dirt. "Every place she shows up, something bad follows. First her pa's barn burns down, then she's run off from 2 towns, and now this. I say leave her." Quentin eased out of the saddle without a word. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud. He walked to her slowly, crouched beside her, and took in the blood crusted on her temple, the way she held her arm stiff as if it hurt. "You hurt bad anywhere?" She shook her head, though her arm trembled. He took off his hat. "You got people?" Her lips parted. "Not anymore." Quentin looked back at the men. "Go on ahead," he said firmly. "Tell Marshal Jennings what happened." "You are not bringing her back to town, Pierce," the oldest man said. "People will say—" "I do not care what they say," Quentin cut in. "She is coming with me." They stared. No one moved. Finally, the old man cursed and turned his horse. One by one, the others followed. Brielle's eyes were wide. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Quentin offered his hand. "Because you are alone, and I do not believe in bad luck." "Just bad men." She hesitated, then took it. Quentin's ranch sat 10 miles outside of Lewistown, a modest stretch of land with a barn, a cabin, and 2 horses in the corral. He had built it himself after leaving the cavalry, trading battlefields for quiet mornings and the ache of honest work. He gave Brielle the spare room. She barely spoke the first 2 days. She cleaned the cut on her forehead with the tin basin and helped gather eggs without being asked. She never smiled. On the 3rd evening, Quentin found her outside in the grass watching the sun go down. Her dress was clean now, and her hair, dark and thick, had been braided back. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "You should not be so kind to me." "Why is that?" "Because people blame me for things I did not do," she said. "My mother died of fever when I was 12. My father's barn burned down that same week. We lost the cattle. Folks said I was bad luck. Then when I married, my husband died in a hunting accident before our first month was up. I have not been welcome anywhere since." Quentin sat beside her, his arms resting on his knees. "Maybe you had a hard run. But I do not believe you caused any of that." She looked over at him, surprised. He shrugged. "I have seen what real misfortune looks like. You are not it." Her voice was small. "You are the first person who has said that." They sat in the silence for a long time. The sky turned gold, then lavender. A week passed. Then 2. Brielle stayed. Quentin taught her to ride his mare, taught her how to mend fence wire and spot a sick calf. She started laughing again. Not much, but enough. One morning, she brought him coffee out by the barn. "I want to work," she said. "You gave me shelter. I want to earn it." "You already do," he said, taking the tin cup. "I mean real work. I want to help." He studied her, the way she stood tall even when her voice wavered. "All right, Miss Callahan. Let us start with the tack room." She grinned. The gossip came fast. They whispered about Quentin down at the mercantile. Said he had lost his mind taking in a girl like her. Said she would bring ruin to his land just like she had everywhere else. He heard it all. And he ignored it. Until the bankman came. "I got word from the council," the man said, standing on Quentin's porch with a folded paper. "They say if you keep her on your land, you are off the town protection list. That means no support if rustlers come. No fire help. You will be on your own." Quentin stared at the paper. "This is not law. It is policy," the man said. "They are scared. Then they are cowards." The man left. That night, Quentin told her everything. You should not risk all this, Brielle said, her voice shaking. This ranch is your life. He stepped closer. So are you now? She looked up at him. You mean that? I do. She blinked fast, emotion rising to her eyes. He touched her cheek, his hand rough but gentle. You are not bad luck, Brielle, he said. You are the bravest woman I have ever met. She leaned forward, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe someone. Their lips met, soft and sure. And when he held her that night, there was no hesitation. No fear. Just two people who had lived through fire, finding something steady in each other. Days turned into weeks. The ranch kept running. And Quentin kept loving her. He showed it in the way he always made sure her coffee was hot in the morning and how he never let her fix a fence alone. She showed it in the way she waited up for him when he rode to town and the lunches she packed in his saddlebag. They were not loud about it, but it was real. Then came the night she woke screaming. Quentin was at her side instantly, holding her as she sobbed into his shirt. I saw the fire again, she whispered. I could not get my father out. I kept screaming, but he was already. He just held her tighter. You are safe. Right here. With me. She clutched his shirt. Do not let them take this from us. They will not, he said. I would give it all up before I lose you. And he meant it. By the end of the month it was clear. No cattle thieves had come. No fires. No floods. Just the steady rhythm of life. And something else. Hope. One morning, Brielle stood in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour. I want to stay, she said. Quentin looked up from the table. You already do. I mean forever. He stood, walked over, and cupped her face gently. Then marry me. She laughed, tears springing to her eyes. Yes. And under the open sky, with no preacher but the wind and no witnesses but the land, they promised each other everything. They called her bad luck. But Quentin knew the truth. She was everything. And she was his. The first frost came early that year. Brielle stood at the edge of the pasture, arms folded tight across her shawl, watching the horses nose at the stiff grass. The world was quiet in that crisp way it only got before winter settled in for good, every sound clearer, sharper. From the barn, she heard the creak of Quentin's boots on hay and the low murmur of him talking to the gelding like he always did when no one was around to hear. She turned when he stepped out, coat collar turned up, sleeves rolled to the wrist despite the cold. You favor the wind more than the stove, he said, brushing straw from his hands. I like to see the seasons change, she replied. It reminds me that nothing stays the same forever. He walked to her, eyes searching her face. What changed today? She hesitated, pulling the shawl tighter. I need to find work in town. Something regular, paid. I want to add to what we're building here. He didn't argue. There's a new teacher position open. They're looking for someone to take over the younger grades. Miss Halpern's gone east to care for her sister. I've never taught. You don't have to have a certificate. Just patience. And you've got plenty of that. She studied his face, the way his jaw tensed when he tried not to sway her decision. I'll ride in tomorrow. He nodded but didn't hide the worry in his eyes. She placed her hand on his chest, steady over his heart. I'm not leaving. I know. It's the town I don't trust, not you. The next morning, she took the mare and rode into Lewistown before light. The schoolhouse sat near the church with whitewashed planks and a roof that needed patching. Inside, the benches were worn smooth by generations of restless legs. The school board chair, a rail-thin man with a bristled mustache, sat behind the desk with his hat still on. You're Quentin Pierce's woman, he said, not bothering to greet her. I'm Brielle Pierce, she answered, lifting her chin. I came about the teaching position. He looked her over, slow and skeptical. Children are impressionable. You understand what that means? I do. You can read and write? Well enough to teach. He tapped a pencil against the desk. We'll give it a week. If any parent pulls their child, you'll be replaced. She didn't flinch. That's fair. At noon, she walked back out into the sunlight. A few women crossed the street to avoid her. One man spat into the dirt when she passed. But she kept walking. She had faced worse. Back at the ranch, Quentin met her at the gate. She handed him the mare's reins and dusted her skirts. They gave me a week. They'll give you more than that, he said, leading the horse toward the barn. They just don't know it yet. That evening, she stood by the stove, peeling potatoes while he sanded a broken yoke outside. The scent of sage and wood smoke drifted in with the dusk. "You never told me why you left the cavalry," she said as he stepped inside, hanging his coat on the hook. He sat at the table, rubbing his thumb along the grain. "After the war, they sent us out here. Said we were protecting settlers. But half the time we were just chasing shadows. I got tired of following orders that didn't make sense." She kept peeling. "Did you ever fire on anyone?" He didn't answer right away. "Once. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 15. He ran when we rode up on his village. I was told he had a rifle. I never saw one." She turned from the stove, knife paused mid-slice. "I was 22, he said. That was the last time I ever followed a command without thinking twice." She crossed the room and knelt beside his chair. "You never told me that. You never asked. I think I understand you better now." He looked down at her, brushing a curl from her cheek. "I want you too." The next morning, children filed into the schoolhouse, boots clattering, voices high with nerves. Brielle stood at the front, hands folded, her hair tied up beneath a simple bonnet. She called roll with a steady voice. Some parents stood outside, arms crossed, daring her to fail. But she didn't. By the fourth day, one boy stayed after class to show her a drawing of a buffalo. On the fifth, a girl with braids brought her a pressed flower in an envelope. On the sixth, no parents pulled their children out. At supper, Quentin said nothing, just slid a folded paper across the table. She opened it, her name written in neat ink, beside the words, "Hired for the season." "What did you do?" she asked, brow furrowed. "Nothing," he said. "They just needed time to see what I already knew." As the first snow dusted the ground, Brielle stood in the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the flakes drift down. Quentin came up behind her, arms slipping around her waist. "You ever think we'd end up here?" "Not once." "Me neither." She leaned into him, warm against the cold. "But I'm glad we did." He kissed her temple, and they stood there until the last light faded, holding on to something that felt like a beginning. The wood stove hissed and popped as the wind pressed against the cabin walls. Brielle stood by the table, drying her hands on a rag. Her gaze caught on the frost creeping along the window's lower pane. A stack of student essays lay untouched beside her. Outside, the pasture was quiet under a pale moon. The horses tucked away in the lean-to Quentin had reinforced last week. Behind her, he latched the door and brushed snow from his shoulders. Old Man Haler's bull wandered down the ravine again. Took me near an hour to coax him back. She turned, crossing to help him unwind his scarf. "You said his fencing was starting to rot last month. He said he'd fix it come spring. Doesn't want to spend before harvest." She folded the scarf, set it on the hook. "If that bull keeps pushing through, he'll break a leg before spring. I told him that." He nodded, same as always. She touched his arm, just above the elbow. "You thinking of offering him help?" His mouth pulled into a thoughtful line. "I might. He's too proud to ask, but he's not got the strength he used to. Then go, before the snow deepens. You've always had a way of getting folks to take help without feeling small." He looked at her for a long moment, then reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You've got a quiet way of seeing people that makes it hard to hide. I was overlooked for years. I had time to learn." He kissed her cheek, slow and deliberate. "I'll ride out tomorrow." The wind rattled the window panes, but the warmth between them held fast. By dawn, Quentin was already gone. Saddle tracks pressed into the fresh snow. Brielle packed her satchel and set out on foot for the schoolhouse. The road was slick, but she moved carefully, keeping to the brush line where the frost hadn't hardened the mud as much. When she arrived, the coal stove was still cold. She lit it with kindling from the basket, crouched low until the flame caught. Her breath fogged in the air as she arranged the desks, checking each inkwell and chalk slate with practiced fingers. By mid-morning, her students filed in. They peeled off mittens and stamped their boots, voices hushed by the cold. She guided them through arithmetic and penmanship, then paused when she saw Henry Travers, the smallest of the group, rubbing his wrists with red fingers. "Henry," she said gently, "where are your gloves?" He kept his head down. "Pa said we couldn't spare for new ones." She crossed to her satchel, pulled out the pair Quentin had given her last winter, still in good shape. "Try these. They're a bit big, but they'll do." His eyes widened. "You sure? They're too warm for my hands anyway." After the children were dismissed, she walked down to the mercantile, the satchel heavy with the day's lessons. Inside, the stove was burning hot and the air smelled of pipe smoke and sackflower. Harriet Ames stood behind the counter, folding muslin. "Afternoon," Brielle greeted, setting her list down. Harriet looked up, her expression unreadable. "Heard about what you did for the Travers boy." "I didn't do much. Just had an extra pair." Harriet nodded slowly. "Still, not everyone would've. Some folks noticed that." Brielle met her gaze, wary. "And some folks don't care to." "True enough." Harriet reached below the counter and placed a small jar of molasses on the wood. "For your pantry." "On the house." Brielle's brows lifted. "That's not necessary." Harriet's voice softened. "Maybe not. But I figure it's time we stop holding ghosts against the living." Brielle left with the molasses wrapped in brown paper, the faintest hum of hope curling in her chest. That night, Quentin returned with his coat damp and his cheeks ruddy from the wind. Brielle served rabbit stew with fresh cornbread, her hands moving with easy rhythm. They ate in comfortable quiet, save for the wind scraping across the eaves. Quentin wiped his mouth and leaned back. "Haler let me mend the corner post. Didn't say thank you, but he brought out coffee after." She smiled faintly. "That's thanks enough from him. He asked after you." She stilled. "What for?" "Said he heard you gave your gloves to a boy who needed them more. Said maybe he'd misjudged." She didn't answer right away. Then, "I never asked to be judged at all. I know. But now they're starting to see what I've always known." She rose, crossed to his side, and laid her hand on his shoulder. "You saw me when no one else dared. I won't forget that." He stood, drawing her into his arms. "I didn't dare. I just knew." She rested her head against his chest, the beat of his heart grounding her. Outside, snow fell soft and steady. Inside, she felt no weight of the past, only the warmth of a man who had never once looked away. The thaw came slow that spring. Brielle walked the ridge above the pasture, careful with her footing where the snow still clung in shaded hollows below. The creek had started to run again, dark water glinting between ice-slick rocks. She carried a sack slung over her shoulder, filled with early shoots of wild onion and the last of the dried apples from the cellar, bound for the Widow Granger 2 claims north. The woman hadn't come to town all winter, and Quentin had said nothing when Brielle announced she'd be walking over. At the rise above the Granger place, she paused, catching her breath and scanning the sloped roof for smoke. None. The shutters hung crooked on the west side. She picked her way down, boots sinking in soft earth, and knocked twice on the door. It opened slow. The widow stood inside, thinner than Brielle remembered. Her dress hung loose at the shoulders, gray hair pulled back in a frayed ribbon. "I brought food," Brielle said, lifting the sack, "and some cloth." "You've got a shutter swinging." The older woman hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in, then." Inside, the hearth was cold. Brielle set down the sack and went straight to the woodpile, stacking kindling until the fire caught. She didn't speak until the room began to warm. "You've been alone all winter?" "Had no choice," the widow said, easing into the rocker. "My boy went down to Miles City in October. Said he'd send for me. Never did." Brielle stirred the coals, then turned. "You should come stay with us. Just until the land firms up. Quentin won't mind." "I know he won't. That's why I hesitated to ask." "You wouldn't be asking. I'm offering." The woman studied her, eyes clearer now in the firelight. "Didn't expect kindness from you. I didn't expect to be here this long, Brielle replied. But it turns out I was wrong about what I deserved. The widow nodded once. Slow. Give me until morning. I'll gather what I need. Brielle left just as the sun dipped, her skirts catching burrs from the brittle grass. When she reached home, the lantern was already lit on the porch and Quentin stood with his sleeves rolled, hammer still in hand.
You took longer than I thought, he said as she reached the step. She's coming back with me. Tomorrow. He finished winding the leather strap around the handle. We'll clear out the front room. Brielle tilted her head. You never ask why. I don't need to. He set the hammer down and looked at her closely. But I will ask something else. What? Would you want to raise a child here? She blinked. Where did that come from? You've been watching the schoolchildren different lately.
Yesterday I saw you linger when that little girl showed you her reading slate. Brielle moved to the porch rail and rested her hands on the worn wood. I never thought I'd have the chance. Not after the way things went before. He stepped beside her, not touching, just near. I'd like a family with you, if you want that too. She turned toward him, a breath caught in her chest. I do. They stood there until the stars came out, soft and scattered. The next morning, Quentin hitched the wagon and drove out with her to fetch the widow.
Brielle sat close, the wind tugging at her shawl, and he kept one hand near hers on the bench, though he didn't take it until they crested the ridge, and she reached for him first. The road back was quiet, the widow silent beside the small bundle at her feet. Quentin didn't push conversation. He just drove steady, the horses trotting light over the softening ground. They reached the ranch by late morning. Quentin helped the widow down, then took her bundle inside without a word.
Brielle stayed back, watching the wind move through the grass, and when he returned, he touched the small of her back like a promise. That evening, she sat cross-legged by the hearth, mending a hem while Quentin trimmed the oil lamp. The widow had gone to bed early, worn thin from the journey. The silence was companionable, warm. You remember that first morning here? Quentin asked. I remember thinking you were far too quiet. He chuckled. You didn't trust me. I didn't trust anyone. He set the lamp down and knelt beside her. You trust me now? She laid her sewing aside, fingers brushing his. With everything. He leaned in, his lips brushing just below her ear. Then let's build the rest of our lives on that. She nodded against him, eyes closing. Outside, the wind settled. The night grew still. And inside, nothing was unfinished anymore. Rain came late that year, slow and steady over 3 days, soaking the fields and turning the west trail to thick clay. When it cleared, everything smelled of pine and wet earth. Quentin stood on the cabin's back stoop, sleeves rolled and collar damp, watching the far ridge where the clouds still dragged their shadows. Brielle stepped out beside him, wiping flour from her palms onto her apron. The fencing held, he said, nodding toward the pasture. I was more worried about the roof, she replied. But not a drop leaked. He glanced at her, the corners of his eyes warming. You patched it better than I ever did. Careful. That almost sounded like praise. He reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. It was. Inside, the widow had taken to the front room as if it were her own, keeping mostly to herself during the day but helping quietly where she could, stirring broth when Brielle's back ached, folding laundry without being asked. She never asked to stay longer, but she hadn't left either. That afternoon, Quentin hitched the wagon and drove east to trade for seed. While he was gone, Brielle sat at the desk in the schoolhouse, ink-stained fingers folded beneath her chin. The children were gone for the week, the spring fair drawing every family for miles. She had stayed to catch up on lesson plans and see to the still leaky stovepipe. Reverend Dobbins stepped into the threshold, hat in hand. I heard you're still teaching, he said. She didn't rise. I am. Some folks weren't sure you'd stay. I wasn't sure I'd be allowed. He nodded, shifting his weight.
The board wants to extend your contract through next year. She blinked. That's unexpected. Not to me. You've steadied more than a few children who didn't take to the last 2 teachers. You've done good here. She stood slowly. Thank you. He hesitated. There's a gathering next week. The town's voting on new council members. You should come. To vote? To run if you want. Nominations are open. She watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him. The idea settled over her like fresh wool, strange at first, but not uncomfortable. That evening, Quentin returned with sacks of barley and a new horseshoe for the mare. He found her by the stove, stirring batter. Do you think I could serve on the town council? She asked without turning. He set the seed down gently. Yes. You didn't even ask why. I don't need to know why. If you believe you should, then I'll stand behind you. She turned to him then, eyes searching. Even if it means standing beside people who once turned me out? Especially then. She stepped into his arms, resting her forehead against his chest. I'm scared. You've done scarier things. The next week, she stood on the steps of the mercantile, reading her own name on the ballot. Faces in the crowd looked different now, less guarded, less wary. Some nodded, some looked away, but no one shouted. No one whispered. After the vote, she and Quentin walked home on foot, hand in hand as the sun dipped behind the cottonwoods. You think they'll choose me? She asked. They already have, he said. The vote just makes it official. By the end of the week, the results were posted. She was elected with 37 votes. The next nearest had 21. That night, she stood with Quentin outside the barn, stars wheeling overhead. The widow had gone to bed early and the wind carried the scent of lilac from the edge of the woods. I didn't think I'd find this kind of peace, Brielle said. Not after everything. Quentin wrapped his arms around her from behind, chin resting on her shoulder. You didn't find it. You made it. She closed her eyes, leaning back into him. Do you think we'll always be happy like this? No, he said. I think we'll have quiet and work and days that pass without much. But I think we'll have each other. And that means we'll be content. That's better than happy. She turned in his arms, reaching up to trace his jaw. I love the way you see the world. He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't need to prove anything. In the months that followed, the ranch grew 2 more calves in the pasture, the fence line extended east. The widow stayed, taking over the garden and sleeping more often in the rocking chair than her bed. Brielle was sworn in at the schoolhouse steps. The whole town gathered, including those who'd once crossed the street to avoid her. She stood tall, voice steady, hand in Quentin's as she promised to serve with fairness and care. That summer, she found herself humming again as she swept the porch, and Quentin's shirt smelled of sun and sweat and cedar. They talked about building a second room for when the baby came, and the mare took to walking beside Brielle as if she knew. They named their daughter Clara, born just after the first snowfall. Quentin held her close by the fire that night, his hands big around her tiny body, and Brielle watched with a quiet awe she hadn't known she could still feel. You think she knows she's safe? Quentin asked. She will, Brielle whispered. Because she has us. Years passed. The schoolhouse needed a new roof. The council built a bridge across the creek. Children grew and some moved away. The widow passed one spring morning with the sun on her face, and they buried her beneath the cottonwoods where she used to sit and shell peas. Clara learned to ride by 6, read by 7, and by 10 she'd started asking how her parents met. Brielle always smiled and said, by chance, but we stayed by choice. And it was true. Every day after, they chose each other again. Through frost and thaw, through fence posts and harvests, through the long hush of winter and the bright green of May, they built a life that held. Not perfect, but full. And always, always together.